Morning, everyone. Welcome back to Hacking Assessment Q&A. I'm here with Isaac Wells, as per usual, and we are in part 2 of our beginning of school series. That's what we decided to call it. And we are going to be talking about setting up routines and rituals around the no grades classroom today. So, Isaac, how was your week? How's everything going?
Good. Been a little tired this week, but lots of good partnerships and good things happening. And on the note of routines, I've been working with a good friend of mine, Holly McMurray, and we are coming up with some awesome routines for K2 students to do in school or at home. So I'm pumped about that. And there's no grades attached to them. It's all learning and mastery.
That's awesome. So there's so many things that we have to think about at the beginning of the school year. And so many times I know that I have been guilty of, like, you wait for a month before you find something good that works, but then you're like, but a month went by already. So now I have to wait for another good beginning before I shift the waters, because it seems like we've already fell into a routine. When you're setting up a classroom that is going to go against what traditional norms do, you have to be so intentional from the beginning that things are going to be different. And one of the things I liked to do in my classroom, especially with my AP students with the 12th grade, I always send home a welcome letter before school started, and it had my syllabus for the year in it, as well as the overall expectations and philosophy of how this class was going to be different. I also had a short screencast video that showed parents how to read our online communication system, because what my back end looked like was very different than all the other teachers. So I just wanted them to know that I was always open for their questions, and this is how things were going to be. And, you know, please feel free to sort of know that the lines are open, and even though it's different, your child is still going to be able to get into college, and there will be a grade ultimately on their transcript, but how we arrive at that grade is going to be very different. So before I get too deeply in, Jamie had asked that we touch upon what's most important for teachers to keep in mind when setting course goals, so that student goals that come from the teacher's course goals can be most effective. And I think that's a really important question. And I know in one of our earlier Q&As, Jamie had asked about choosing those power standards and making choices about what we focus on. Part of what helped me do that was developing my syllabus. And at the time, since it was an AP class, there were some criteria I had to take from the College Board in terms of what skills and content needed to be covered to ensure that students were ready for the exam at the end of the year, but more importantly, ready for college when they left my class. And what I did was I thought about the larger New York State standards, and each of you, whichever state you're in, if you have your own state standards, or you have the Common Core that you're still using, or you're using the ISTE standards, or you're using, you know, the College Board standards, choose the ones that you know fit within the curriculum that you're already doing. Make sure that the alignment is there. If you have a curriculum already written, what you really just need to think about is how are they going to be assessed, and building that into the conversation you have with students right away. Last week, we talked about shifting the grading mindset, and that's going to be a part of your routines as well. Just because you had that conversation once on one of the first few days of school doesn't mean that conversation is not going to resurface. As a matter of fact, you will likely have that conversation way more than you want to. I hate to break it to you. You will have kids who will approach you after assessments have been submitted with the "what did I get" statement, and you'll have to take a big deep breath and say, okay, well, you know, let's let's talk about what you learned instead of what you got. Do we, how do we think about learning in this space? It's going to be a refocus for a long time. And those of you who teach high school, and students who are used to having that other conversation in all their other classes, you have the additional burden of shifting it more frequently. In elementary schools, my hope is that this is a little bit more common for folks to be standards-based in the K-5 environment, and even so toward middle school. But obviously, once there is multiple teachers, you're competing with a system that's not working in concert with you, unless you're one of the lucky few who get to be in a school that has made the decision to make that change. So, Isaac, what are your tips about specific routines and rituals around having conversations about learning that don't emphasize actual grades?
I know in our work together in Spartanburg, we really focused on the idea of deliberate practice, and that what's really shifting the impact of that practice is kids knowing where they're going with it. What's my goal? How is this really going to help me? And so I think that's a big part of the conversation with any age kid, but especially since I do most of my work in elementary, that they understand, even if it's not gamified the way that really means, but you're kind of playing a game to get better at something. And when they know that it will open them up to be able to solve new problems, to be able to read more or more varied books, things like that, that's a very different goal than getting it right or getting that grade. So then we know none of us can do this yet. We've just started kindergarten. We've just started 5th grade, whatever it might be. But I've got this goal here and I can work toward it. So I think with the class, when we focus on those big goals and say, hey, here's some ways we can get there, we can do that. And then, of course, the routines and rituals add that structure. Because just like, we always use sports analogies, we probably overdo that. But without the structure of a sport, you don't develop those skills. I love basketball and soccer growing up and played forever, but like those skills are not that useful in life other than, being able to run. But because we had that goal of we want to be able to win this game, or we just want to be able to play and have fun, it made a lot of sense to do dribbling drills and to do passing drills. So, in sports, that's our routines. We run these drills until we are out of breath and really tired of them. In school, we run, even some number sense routines, or we run, we were just coming up with a monkey see, monkey do for learning how books work in kindergarten or even early 1st grade. But then once they learn those 3 or 4 steps, they know we can do this over and over.
And that being said, in high school as well, I know, getting back to Jamie's question about setting goals that align, there are certain things that I set up right away for kids. First of all, their progress trackers are the first thing I generally set up with them. That's a routine I want them to get into. They could either put it in the back of a physical notebook if they're the kind of kid who likes to write things down, or they could keep a document inside of their Google Docs where when I put a comment on a Google Doc, they can just cut and paste the feedback I gave them on which assignment with whatever instructional strategies were in there as well. And then they could track their next steps. So that's a really important routine to set up so that students are really accountable for their learning. They are thinking about the feedback that they get. And ultimately, it also gives them the opportunity to start setting their own goals. In the beginning, it's going to be mostly you giving them the feedback until they get used to what good feedback looks like. You'll always align the feedback with whatever your success criteria was. So even getting them into the habit of looking for a learning target in the same spot in every single day, making sure that learning target is an integral part of the conversation, not just on the wall and up there because your administrator's walking by at some point and it's supposed to be there. But that it's there and it's meaningful, and kids understand that that is the transparency of what's being learned. I also used to put an agenda on the board so that it wasn't just a learning target. There was a whole structure to the period. And when students would walk in and say, "What are we doing today?" I would direct them back to the board, and I'd be like, "You know where to look. It's always in the same space." For my journalism classes, because those classes were very much like lab classes, all the students in the class were doing different things. So there was a menu that was always on the left-hand side of the classroom where kids walked in, they could be doing any of the many things that were listed on that board. And basically at the beginning of the week on Monday, they were setting goals on Monday for the week. And then they also had to track what they did all week. And then they submitted their logs at the end of the week for what they did. And in that class, I also had a student manager who took the status of the class for me. Like, her job was to make sure deadlines were being met, reporters were doing the work they were supposed to do, and editors were providing feedback so that kids could actually get their work done on time. And then I was really there to make sure that the editors felt supported in the feedback they were giving. And if there was a problem that was bigger than a student could handle, whether it was something libelous or something that was concerning and unbalanced, that usually fell to me so that the student wouldn't have a confrontation with another student needlessly. So those were all routines that kind of got set up. Like, when you walk into the classroom, you go get your Chromebook, you come have a seat in the room wherever you are. If we're working on a project and you're in your groups, you convene that way. But students need, we can't assume that they just know those things. And I used to start the school year different every year. Sometimes I would intentionally hang things around the room with space for kids to help contribute to the look of the room. Sometimes we would do a scavenger hunt or a gallery walk where I had them notice what made this room different than other rooms. We had a goal wall, like with clouds, and students added their goals on sentence strips. And then once the goal was met, we would take the goal down and put a new one up. It was definitely a big part of how we structured class and where they ended up in the expert groups and teams, largely based on their own goals that ended up happening.
That's so powerful. And you're kind of making me think of, one of the primary examples of that is when we kind of develop that ritual of looking at something like a writing progression. I just shared a quick video that's one of our old favorites with Sarah Rube or Ruby, I can't remember. But, when kids know that we're going to look to this each time, and one of the first routines students develop in early kinder is to know that they look at the example and they look at their own, and then they just have to add one or two more details because, of course, 5-year-olds come drawing those mandala figures, which is the little ball with a few pointy things coming out. But within a week, we can get kids drawing faces on those, and we can get them to add kind of almost like a snowman for a body. And you just kind of brought that to mind when you were talking about how they use those things on the wall. They're not there to check the box. They're there for kids to use it. But of course, sometimes it takes 5 times, sometimes it takes 50 to get them to really own that. And it also, as you were sharing these ideas about things around the room and then becoming experts, made me think in all grades again, but especially this year, as we know, we've said there are many strategies that work regardless of situation, but this year is considerably different. If you're not doing some virtual learning now, you will be at some point in the year, and you probably are now. But even to establish those routines and rituals, just the same as I take my backpack off, I give my folder to my teacher, and then I find my place to read or I find my station. Now it's going to be, I plug in my headphones, I, make sure I can see, or I get my letters that my teacher sent to my house, or I get my salt to write on, or whatever it might be. But remembering that those things are not behaviors to be graded. They're not for a color chart. They're not for marking you up or marking you down. They're routines that help us learn. And we're I hope the kids and parents are patient with us. I know we need to be patient with them because it's going to be a struggle, but we've really added a level of need for routine.
It's
uh,
true, and I think in this environment in particular, having Zoom or Meet
mhm.
routines is very important. Um, and just making sure that we're still building a culture in our spaces.
Right.
Like the whole point of the no grades classroom is to ensure that voices are heard, that we're not labeling
Mhm.
kids, that we're giving them multiple opportunities to show what they know. And inside of those routines and rituals, we need to make sure that we do develop this culture in our spaces that invites and promotes people to speak up, even in disagreement
Mhm.
where necessary. And those voices of disagreement are as important as the ones that agree. My students always used to think it was amusing that I encouraged them to disagree with each other, but it's really how we grow.
Mhm.
Hearing different perspectives, being open to hearing different perspectives, and that's a norm that needs to be built in at the beginning of the year as well, that all voices are welcome and no idea is too silly or off the mark as long as it's really focused on what we're working
Mhm.
on right now. Obviously, we don't want to go off on some
Yeah.
wackadoo tangent that, although it might be very interesting, just doesn't really fit with what we're doing right now.
Mhm.
And especially in this hybrid environment, I have to imagine that because the amount of actual instructional time is going to be diminished in the way that we think about it, we need to put structures in place so that kids know how to be independent learners, whether they're in the classroom with us or they're at home with their parents. And a lot of that has to center around the way we give directions, how many exemplars and examples we provide for them, teaching them to, check their own work, like Isaac was saying, for the youngsters. The older students need to be doing the same thing.
Mhm.
The teacher isn't the only one who could be giving them feedback, and the better we get them at identifying where they need help, then they could ask more targeted questions, and that
Mhm.
becomes a part of the routine as well. That is, really important. One of the other things I wanted to mention about what was on the wall are your standards. They should be in student-friendly language. Another activity I used to do at the beginning of the year was set the standards in front of the students and let them rewrite them on sentence strips. And when we were addressing specific standards, they were always on the wall so that when kids were talking about their learning, they could use that language to talk about the skill building we were doing at that time, or
Mhm.
the content. If you're in a science class or a social studies class, you're looking at something really specific. We want to make sure that kids have that language, whether it's a word wall, a standards wall, and we're keeping a balance between a text-rich environment and one that isn't too cluttered for some of our students who might not fare well in very cluttered spaces, because we do need to be
Mhm.
cognizant that not everybody appreciates a lot of things around that can be very distracting sometimes. So we do want to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all the kids that are in our spaces, and not just checking boxes to make sure every inch of the wall is
Mhm.
with anchor charts and student
Yeah.
work.
It's very easily ignored, especially once it's been there for a while.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the other thing too. We need to rotate what we have in the spaces so that it
Mhm.
matches what we're doing in class at that time, because we want the space to be not only a mirror of the learning that's happening in the space, but we want kids to be able to reference the exemplars and in progress work that we hang as a way for them to support themselves as learners. And if we are in a hybrid or fully digital environment, setting up websites that do the same thing, and you could do that
Mhm.
through Google Sites and just keep it private so that kids in class can see what's going on, but you're not sending their work out to the greater world for people to see if it's not ready to be
Right.
published. So I don't know. I'm curious to the folks who are out there today. We don't have
Mhm.
lots of comments. Casey, I'm glad that you like the idea of students rewriting standards. It's a really easy thing to do in terms of when you're teaching kids about success criteria as well. Just aligning those standards with the success criteria and helping students understand that their voices are a part of their own understanding of what makes something masterful or proficient, and getting them involved in that process is another thing that you'll have to set up a ritual around. When we started new projects, for example, we had the protocol of I would either email the project sheet, and students would be expected to annotate the project sheet before we had time in class. Now, I also accounted for the fact that some students might not do that. And at the beginning of class, I would ask them to take out their annotated sheets and in their small groups, sort of go through the sheets together and really highlight the things they thought were most salient and what they thought they were going to do to approach it. And then as a group, we would generate success criteria, and we'd create a single point rubric out of that success criteria that they would use to help keep them on track throughout the project. And then moving forward, depending on the benchmark dates when pieces were due, they would come to class each day. They got to work right away, maybe 10 minutes into the period, I would stop them to teach whatever mini lesson needed to be taught. And then I was doing small group instruction for the rest of that project time that was going on. And I really tried to also teach kids about the routines of what conferencing was going to look like, since they were already tracking their progress. At the beginning of the year, I'd send out a Google form to help them prepare for those conferences, where they were answering very targeted questions, so they knew what we were going to be talking about, and starting to build that in as well, that this is a part of how we learn. The portfolio is a part of how we show what we learn, and that we're maintaining these things all along the way with our reflections, so that when it comes time to look back on our learning, there's real evidence that is apparent to talk about that growth and progress.
Casey shared she's a bit nervous, even with 33 years of experience in the classroom, about those routines and rituals virtually. And I love having someone who's that level of expert admit that. And I was on with Paul, I don't know, this week, one day, and we were having a conversation about this idea that there are strategies and things that always work, but we can't discount how different this is. I mean, there's so many variables. And so I love her vulnerability with that, and hope that this community will continue to share great ideas that you have, and things that are working and things that aren't working, because we'll learn it together. And I don't know if you saw this, but Matt's reaching out from band camp. So that's some real dedication.
Awesome. I wanted to know if he was like marching. Are they marching right now? That would be awesome.
Yeah, he'll have to let us know. Maybe he can add a little video in.
That would be fun.
It's been 20 years for me, but I have fond memories, along with some stressful, hot, sweaty memories, but of band camp.
I never got to do a band camp. I was in the chorus. I didn't play in the band, so we didn't have anything like that, unfortunately. We just competed and sang. I'm thinking also, as we're starting to wrap up for today, about the document that I created that kind of helps with this series. And although we didn't have a whole bunch of commenting going on today in terms of what folks were thinking, I would love to know more about your routines and rituals. Maybe the normal ones that you would have done if you were in the classroom. And then we could, as a group, think about how to adapt those things for this environment. I find a lot of times that when you're looking at the same thing for a long time, sometimes it's hard to think of how it could look differently, but maybe having other eyes on your ideas can help you adapt the stuff you're already doing. And if that's the case, drop your ideas into the spreadsheet that we've been using. I have kept it open source so that folks could add more in there. I believe our next our next week topic is going to be all about selecting standards and building progressions for mastery learning, which is pretty specific. And if there's some things that you do that you'd like us to highlight, I would love that. If there are questions you have, drop them on that spreadsheet as well, and I'll make sure that we address them. Additionally, moving forward, Isaac and I were thinking that maybe one or two of you would be able to be guests on the live show. And if there is a topic you feel really passionately about that you'd like to be a part of the live conversation, just add your name and your email on there and we could work out a date. I mean, you have the dates on there. And if the date works for you, it would be nice to have a third person having the conversation with us about those particular things. Who was just speaking about the reflection guideline has
Let
been
me check. I was a little slow on my type. Oh, that's Matt again.
Awesome. Yeah,
Very
I mean,
cool.
I think it's so important that when we start moving away from grades, and this is going to be my takeaway from today, there's a vacuum that you are going to need to fill to move that conversation away and to get more people to buy in. The more solid you are in the routines and rituals that you have in your spaces, and the better you communicate them to students and families and colleagues and administrators, the better off you're going to be. It took me years to find ones that worked when I was trying to figure all this out by myself. And now we have the benefit of this awesome Facebook group and a lot of other people who are doing this great and challenging work. Like, let's use this community to go into this school year as prepared as possible. And you know what? It's still challenging. We'll still make mistakes. We'll still be learning all along the way, and that's super important. But each one of those mistakes is an opportunity to really streamline the challenge and come up with a new solution so that the next time that same challenge arises, we have better structures in place to handle them when they do. So Isaac,
Matt shared on the calendar document what he was just talking about, and I reposted a quick link to the calendar too.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for this week's setting up routines and rituals and your participation. I'm going to be rerunning these videos on my website. You could always watch them here as well on Facebook. And what I've been doing is I've been linking the video once it's posted into the document as well. So if you want to go back to last week's, you could just click the link in the document and it'll bring you right to last week's video. Anyway, have an awesome weekend. Thank you as always, Isaac, and we'll be seeing you next week.